Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Alexandra Alvarado. I'm the Director of Marketing and Education here at the American Apartment Owners Association. And I am so glad to have with us Richard Gann, also known as Rick, to present a really great topic on overcoming the 3 worst fears for replacing your rental, which are finding, borrowing, and timing. So if you are planning to sell your rental now or in the future, this is definitely a great webinar for you to be on the call for. And Rick is going to definitely give us some interesting information about how we can overcome these fears and really prepare for that selling or exit of your properties. But before we get started, just want to go over a few things. One is we are recording this entire webinar. So if you miss out on anything, don't worry, we're going to email you the recording tomorrow. And you'll also get Rick's information so that you can follow up with him if you did want to consult on your particular situation. Rick is going to be answering some questions. So if you can put your questions in the question box, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll see what's in there and hopefully get your questions answered. But if we can't get to all the questions, no worries. Rick will definitely be in touch with you after with some answers. And with that being said, Rick, thank you so much for coming back on. And, I love it when you come and speak to us about these topics. It always is a little different. And I think we always learn something new.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Hopefully that continues to be the case today. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this first day of June. I hope you all had a great Memorial Day weekend. Thank you to AAOA and particularly to Alexandra for inviting me to speak again today. The premise for today's webinar is that many rental housing providers, perhaps like many of you, are physically and mentally ready to replace their rental property, but are reluctant to proceed with listing their property for sale for various reasons. And over time, we have identified basically 3 categorical areas of the greatest concerns that people have about replacing their rentals. And like many fears, we have found that a little education can go a long way to help people overcome each of these fears and ultimately become comfortable with selling their rental property. Before we go any further, I am required to tell you that this presentation is not a solicitation. Real estate and real estate securities may not be suitable for all investors. The risks of investing in real estate programs are no less than the risks of direct real estate ownership. Investing in securitized real estate programs typically involves higher fees than traditional investing. As in traditional real estate, there are no guarantees as to principal or income. And although the name of our company is 1031 Capital Solutions, we do not give tax or legal advice. A little bit about us. My office is in Lake Oswego, Oregon, just south of Portland. My partner, Jason McMurtry, is down in San Diego County. We also have satellite offices in San Francisco and Seattle, as well as team members who work remotely from Denver and Orange County. At the moment, I am in sunny Palm Springs, which explains the bright glare coming from behind me. I'm an attorney by trade, and Jason has an MBA. We've both been working in this industry together since 1998. I encourage everyone to visit our website, 1031capitalsolutions.com, where we have copious articles and blogs and videos and educational content. And in a nutshell, we are a financial services firm that exists for the purpose of helping individual property owners retire from being landlords. And on that note, in May of 2020, we published a book on this very topic, which is available in both print and electronic formats on Amazon. However, if you go onto our homepage, or even easier, respond to this survey, we would be happy to send you a copy directly. And again, you can get a digital copy, or if you provide us your information, we are happy to mail to you a hard copy. I prefer reading good old-fashioned books myself. Probably some of you are that way as well. So happy to get you a free hard copy of the book. I'll give you a second to respond here. All right. Now, before we jump into our first topic, please know that I intend to provide plenty of time for Q&A. But if somehow we don't adequately address a subject or answer your question, you are welcome to schedule a call on our website. So hold on with us until the end, and then again, I'll spend as much time as you all would like answering whatever questions might be stirred up by our presentation today. Now, to ease into the topic of real estate investing and taxation, I thought I would start with a real Jeopardy question. The category for this question on Jeopardy was, it was 1970s America, man. I showed this image on an AAOA webinar last year, so forgive me if you've already seen this. But this was a Jeopardy question from January 2022. The answer, of course, is property taxes. But what's funny is, even though there is some mention of Proposition 13 in the media, literally on a weekly basis, I can't tell you how many people called me or texted me to tell me that my grandfather, Paul Gann, was part of a Jeopardy question. So somehow we've made it into trivia pop culture on Jeopardy. The point of all that is that when your grandfather was perhaps the most famous tax crusader in the country, you end up knowing more about property taxes than any child should have to know. And so it's no surprise that today, 45 years after Prop 13, I am still spending every day literally talking to people about how their real estate is taxed. Okay, enough of that. So let's talk about the worst fears people have about replacing their rental property. And the first is the fear of not being able to find and operate a suitable property in a desirable location. Second is the fear of not being able to borrow the funds necessary to complete an exchange. And that may not apply to all of you, but it is a significant fear for the folks who have debt on their current rental property. And then finally, the fear of not being able to identify a suitable property before the IRS deadlines. I should also say that my talk today presumes that, but for these fears, you are otherwise motivated to sell your property because you would like to escape the burdens and costs and liabilities and aggravations of directly owning and operating residential rental real estate. If you are completely content with being an owner-operator now and for the foreseeable future, I congratulate you, and this webinar is not for you. So let's start with the first fear, finding a replacement property. For most of our clients, the pain of being a landlord is not only a function of age and economics, but also the regulatory burdens of owning property on the West Coast. Thus, to truly address the issues that are driving folks to sell, they ideally would replace their current rental with a property in a more landlord-friendly state. And as you can see on the graphic here, believe it or not, there are states in the middle of the country and in the Southeast that not only don't have rent control regulations, but that actually constitutionally prohibit the state, counties, or cities within that state from passing the type of legislation that we now see here on the West Coast. Now, of course, the prospect of finding such a property in some other state is daunting, if not impossible, because it requires first that you have a real estate agent or broker in in each of the markets that you're thinking about buying in, this task of finding property in another state may require you to conduct market research for multiple markets, MSAs, submarkets, neighborhoods. It requires you to have to find new local service providers and all the folks that you currently rely on to help you operate your business now, or to help you find the property that you originally acquired. All of those people that help in that process of finding, securing, and operating real estate, you now have to go find a new deal team in one or more markets outside of the state. You have to become familiar with different regulations depending on where you're going to buy. You also have to go through the process of figuring out how you are going to attract and screen tenants if you intend to buy, especially residential rental real estate in other markets. And then, of course, incur the travel costs upfront and ongoing. And so that collectively, that whole process is enough for many people to just forego entirely the thought of going and finding a suitable replacement property and causing them to just stick with what they have. Well, as we'll see in a moment, there are investment solutions in which all of this legwork has already been done by an acquisition team of an institutional real estate sponsor, and all you need is a firm like 1031 Capital Solutions to help you narrow the 30 or 40 current options that are available at that time down to 2 or 3 solid candidates for your replacement situation. Now, regardless of your confidence in being able to find a replacement property, you still could have issues with financing such a property. Of course, for those of you with no outstanding debt on your current rental property, this may not be a concern. For the rest of you, remember that in a 1031 exchange, to fully defer your capital gains taxes under IRS rules, you must replace the entire value of the rental property you sold. This means you must replace all of your equity and all of your debt. For example, if you have a $2 million property with an $800,000 loan, you cannot just merely reinvest your $1.2 million of cash in a 1031 exchange. I literally last week had a client who thought this was the rule. Okay, no, the IRS requires you to buy $2 million of real estate as your replacement, which means in my example, you would either need to pull $800,000 out of your savings account to replace the loan that you had that you just paid off, or more typically, you need to obtain another loan. Now, naturally, most people do not want to go through the process of securing another loan, especially in our current banking and interest rate environment. Even worse, some landlords may not be able to qualify for a loan without borrowing from some guy working out of the back of a butcher shop. So as a result, if you are either unwilling or unable to go through the process of getting another loan, you likely will not want to do a 1031 exchange, which means you won't be able to sell your rental property without taking a tax hit. Again, this is another fear we can overcome by offering investment programs that come with prearranged, built-in, non-recourse financing that allows 1031 investors to replace their debt without even applying for a loan. Finally, the third fear people have about replacing their property, even if they are not worried about financing, is that they can't find and close on a new property within the short 1031 deadlines. As I'm sure you know, in a 1031 exchange, you must identify what you intend to buy within 45 days of selling your relinquished property and close the purchase within 180 days. Now, over the last 2 years, when the real estate market was really hot, people selling rental property on the West Coast in particular really struggled to find and close on their replacements. And if they hadn't put a lot of work in ahead of time, or didn't have a deal already negotiated before they sold their rental property, some folks simply couldn't meet the IRS deadlines. We saw this all the time. Unfortunately, if you have already sold your property and somehow you fail to meet either the 45-day identification deadline or the 180-day closing deadline, your entire transaction will be taxed. And this is tragic when this happens, and yet, unfortunately, we hear about this anecdotally on a regular basis. Thankfully, things have cooled off a little bit. 1031 transaction volume has cooled off, at least in the first quarter of this year. Things are picking back up again now, but we are not seeing the craziness right now that we saw 15 months ago, for example. Nevertheless, it's never easy at any time to go out and identify and secure a replacement property in a 1031 exchange when you only have 45 days to commit to a particular property. Now, hopefully you are sensing a pattern here, because once again, we have a solution that not only laughs in the face of IRS deadline danger, but routinely rescues wayward exchangers from fiscal doom. And one answer to all of these fears, of course, is to swap your current rental property for a passive replacement program. And generally speaking, a passive replacement program comprises one or more institutionally managed properties in a single investment vehicle, packaged to qualify as like-kind real estate in a 1031 exchange, and then offered to hundreds of accredited investors on an entirely passive basis. And passive replacement programs, generally speaking, have some common attributes, including the fact that we have dozens of investment programs at any given time, mostly in major Southeast markets. And so, of course, we've got properties in Arizona and Colorado and Tennessee and Texas. And occasionally we've got some that sprinkle up into the Midwest and even to the coast. But the vast majority of the programs that we have today are in the South Central and Southeast parts of the United States. The minimum investment requirements for these passive replacement programs typically range from between 100,000 to 500,000, most are 100,000, frankly. With very rare exceptions, you can invest any dollar amount, meaning that there's no incremental minimum. And most of these programs allow you to have any oddball dollar amount down to the penny to invest in a particular passive replacement program. The most common sectors that we see in these passive replacement programs are multifamily, which is probably half of the entire market, and then self-storage, industrial, senior housing, and triple net retail kind of round out the other most popular categories for these investment programs. And all this is available with a one-stop shop approach, meaning that unlike traditional real estate, where you may need to secure multiple agents and brokers out looking to find a replacement property in different markets, with the passive replacement programs, you can do all that through one conduit, again, like 1031 Capital Solutions, that provides you the access to all of these programs that are available at any given time. Furthermore, the difference between the financing in a passive replacement program versus obtaining your own loan from a bank is like night and day. And I'll use the DST as the most common example. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But in a typical DST structure, which is again the most common passive replacement program, the loan that is in place in the investment program does not require any qualification by the investors going into that deal. In fact, the loan already exists and is in place before the first investors walk in the door. There's no loan application. Investors are not a party to the loan agreement. In fact, the bank doesn't know who you are. There's no personal recourse under the loan. You're not responsible for making any loan payments. You don't have to sign any notarized closing documents. There's no public record of the loan. And so as a result, the debt that you have on your rental property that is currently tied to your personal balance sheet, that disappears, which improves your balance sheet and and presumably your credit score to the extent that you want to go and borrow money for some other project or some other property. There's a tremendous benefit in taking that loan off of your shoulders, allowing you to replace that loan with built-in pre-arranged non-recourse financing, but without having that debt linked to you for credit purposes. Of course, most importantly, the debt that is part of a DST program or other passive replacement program is still considered debt replacement for purposes of a 1031 exchange. Unlike a traditional real estate transaction, when you invest in a passive replacement program to complete a 1031 exchange, there is no escrow, no notary. In fact, all the transaction documents are processed via DocuSign. You have typically the ability to close the transaction from the time that you sign some DocuSign paperwork to the time that your money is invested in the real estate. It's 5 to 7 business days, and sometimes we can make that even shorter. And as a result of this, by the way, we typically are closing these investments long before the 45-day identification deadline, meaning that while in a typical 1031 exchange, people are scrambling to identify some replacement properties within a 45-day deadline and then hoping to close that transaction sometime after the 45-day deadline, but before the 180 days. We are generally not concerned with any of those deadlines because our clients, if they come to us, at least during the escrow period of selling their rental property, we will go through the investment exploration process, make recommendations, get the investment paperwork signed, and so that your money is only sitting with the qualified intermediary after the sale of your relinquished property for a few business days, and then boom, is reinvested. Your money's going right back to work for you, and we're not concerned about any deadlines because we've managed to reinvest all of your equity from the sale of your property within the first week or two after your sale. And that's an amazing distinction from a typical real estate transaction where you're dealing with an escrow period and all of the opportunities that you're all familiar with for a deal to go sideways. It's not the purpose of my presentation today to delve deep into investment products, but as a quick overview, our 1031 qualified passive replacement programs fall into one of 3 categories. As I mentioned, Delaware statutory trusts. Sometimes you hear the word DST, not to be confused with a deferred sales trust, which is something completely different. But the Delaware statutory trust is the primary go-to strategy. We also offer UPREIT programs, which the biggest difference between a traditional DST and a DST UPREIT program is that at the end of the UPREIT strategy, you end up owning essentially interests, operating partnership interests in a REIT, and therefore you no longer have to do any subsequent 1031 exchanges. The typical DST program, for most people, is going to require 2, 3, 4 1031 exchanges over the rest of your life, as we were rolling in and out of DST properties in successive 1031 exchanges. In both of those strategies, you're starting off initially with a 1031 exchange of your rental property, into a DST property. And then we have a program which is in recent years has started to become a little bit more popular, and we're starting to see multiple sponsors offering, which is reinvesting the proceeds of your rental property into 1031 qualified mineral rights interests, where essentially your income is being generated from from energy programs, which are royalties that are recorded at the county recorder's office of dozens of properties in typically in Texas and Oklahoma and Pennsylvania, where you get income from oil and gas programs that are located on those properties. And believe it or not, that is real estate. Mineral rights are like-kind real estate. This is not cutting-edge stuff. This is people have been 1031 exchanging into mineral rights for decades. The difference is that it's been more recent, where folks have created these passive replacement programs where these deals are packaged up so that rather than invest in a traditional rental property, meaning an apartment community or a self-storage facility, you are 1031 exchanging into a basket of diversified mineral rights. So and that's something that we've been doing more of lately. Now, while each of these strategies are different and have their own pros and cons and suitability factors, they are all designed to give individual owners with highly appreciated property the opportunity to retire from being landlords, obviously to avoid capital gains tax. Ultimately, if you continue implementing the strategy for the rest of your life, you are doing more than just deferring the tax. You are literally avoiding the capital gains tax altogether by your family enjoying the step up in basis that occurs on your real estate when you pass away, and therefore this tax can that got kicked down the road ultimately disappears. These programs also allow across the board investors to invest in institutionally managed real estate in landlord-friendly states, as I mentioned, and most importantly, receive passive monthly income without the burdens of direct ownership. Again, passive replacement programs is passive for a reason, because one thing that all these programs have in common is that investors are along for the ride. We put together a portfolio for you, and then after that, you are no longer thinking about your real estate anymore. And so in that respect, for a lot of people, this is more than just an investment. It's a complete change in your lifestyle, and no longer having the burdens of being an individual mom and pop landlord, owner operator, and getting to transition out of that into like we say, truly, quote, retiring from being a landlord. It can really make a big difference, not only financially, but in the quality of your life. Last year alone, thousands of 1031 exchanging taxpayers, just like all of you, invested in $15 billion worth of passive replacement programs, most of which went into Class A apartment communities, but also, as I mentioned, warehouse distribution and self-storage, among others. If you visit our website at 1031capitalsolutions.com, please check out our huge catalog of educational materials and videos. We have 3 video series comprising 27 short videos on the topics of 1031 exchanges, real estate taxation, and passive investing. And if you'd like to schedule a call with me or my partner, Jason McMurtry, it's literally as easily as checking a button. Or if you just click on the yes button here on your screen, your information will get transmitted to us from AOA, and we will reach out and schedule an appointment for you as well. So we are going out of our way to try to make it as easy as we can for all of you to get more information, to get questions answered. And if you're closer to a transaction, then we would love to work with you on whatever is coming up your calendar in terms of potentially doing an exchange with one of your existing rental properties. So with that, Alexandra, I would love to take some time to answer some questions. I hope we have some.
We do have some questions. So TNC landlord asking, are you doing clean energy in California?
That's a great question. I have not yet seen on my radar a 1031 qualified investment program that offers access to clean energy. I have to believe that is coming, because I think there's a demand for it, and so the short answer is not yet, but based on on trends and how popular those types of programs are in the non-1031 context, and we do have non-1031 programs that offer access to green energy. It's only a matter of time before we start to see 1031 qualified programs, but as of right now, unfortunately, no.
All right. Also from TNC landlord, and I know you went over some of these, but can you give us a high level pros and cons of DST 1031 exchanges?
Well, the first thing I always discuss when I'm talking about pros and cons of any of these investment programs is that part of being passive also means illiquid, meaning that these are programs where you're investing, typically 1 to 3 DST programs to replace whatever you sold. And then, like I said, you're along for the ride. And what that means is you are not in control of anything that's happening with that investment program while you are receiving, just like you're not in control of the stock picking that your mutual fund does. And you are just waiting for, in a typical DST, for that property to be sold. And which, by the way, the average life cycle of a Delaware statutory trust property is about 6 years on average, meaning that, and it could be 5, it could be 7, but you are essentially receiving monthly income for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And then the DST sponsor is then in charge of determining when it makes sense to market that property. Oftentimes there's a correlation between the property being sold and when the interest only period on the underlying loan expires. And so it's not a coincidence that these DST sponsors look to sell these properties before the interest only period ends, so that the debt service doesn't dramatically cut into the distributions. But my point of all that is, in the meantime, you are in that program, and there is not a secondary market for DST shares. You can't just pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I'd like my $500,000 or $1 million back." And with very rare exceptions, you essentially are investing in an illiquid basis. And so as a result, the first thing I tell people is, if you think you need to access this money from the sale of your rental property freely, then you should go and invest in a rental property that you think you can turn around and sell quickly if you needed to, because you just don't have that option. And again, most people, that's fine. They have other sources. They're not concerned about having immediate access to those funds. They know that real estate's a long-term investment. The property they just sold, they had for 20 years. So they don't think of this money as being liquid in the first place. But that's an important caveat. And the second is that I mentioned is that the expenses of investing in a programmatic 1031 strategy are going to be higher than the costs of you going and finding your own real estate. But the costs that you're incurring include all of the things that you didn't have to do to find, source, negotiate, finance, operate, etc., the property that you invested. And so it's illiquid, it's a little bit more expensive, but it's also institutional and gives you an opportunity to diversify across geographies and sectors, etc.
Well said. There is always a cost to convenience. So it's all about how much that convenience is worth to you. TNC landlord also asked, would it be possible to lose the entire investment?
Well, I'm not going to say no. Theoretically, you can lose your entire investment in any real estate. But having said that, the risks of the real estate risks of investing in as a fractional owner in an apartment community are no different than the real estate risks of a pension fund buying that apartment community. So the real estate risks are the same regardless of whether that apartment community is owned by one institution or 275 individual investors. So there's nothing about the DST structure that impacts, for better or for worse, the default real estate risks of any particular property. Now, of course, leverage and borrowing obviously can amplify both upside and downside risk. The typical leverage on a DST these days is about 40% of the value, meaning the loan is typically 40% of the offering value. And then we have lots of programs now that don't have any debt on them at all. So the leverage risk is relatively low, and these programs are all institutionally operated. All the programs that we offer are well insured, and so the risk of complete loss of capital is pretty darn low.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there's a reason why we're all involved in real estate, and typically there tends to be a gain over time. So that helps. Also, Mitra asking here about tax obligations under several different scenarios. She has a paid off property that is currently being rented out. It's been a rental for many years. And she's wondering what the tax obligations would be if she sells her rental via 1031 exchange to a higher price. So I think that means purchasing another property at a higher price. 2 would be exchanging for the same amount. And then 3 is sell but buy a less expensive place.
Yes.
And 4 is leave it as a rental and have the beneficiary sell the rental as soon as they inherit the rental to avoid taxes.
Okay, great. So let me start. The first 3 questions are sort of 1031 exchange amount. So the basic rule of a 1031 exchange is that you can defer all of the capital gains taxes that you would otherwise incur as long as you buy as much or more real estate than you just sold. So it is commonplace, especially with us, that our clients will end up acquiring more real estate than they just sold, because oftentimes the loan to value ratio on the property that they're investing in is higher than what they just sold. So to answer your question, you can always buy more real estate, and of course, by doing that, the source of the funds, it has to either come out of your pocket or additional leverage, right? But there's no problem and no tax consequence in an otherwise completed 1031 exchange of buying more real estate than you sold. On the other end, sometimes I bump into this misunderstanding that somehow you are required to replace every penny of the property you sold, and if you fail to do so, that somehow it blows your entire exchange. That is not the case. In other words, if you sell a property for $1 million and you buy a replacement property for $950,000, you didn't blow your 1031 exchange, but you will be taxed on the $50,000 difference between what you sold and what you bought. So our goal, of course, is to completely replace, if not exceed, the value of the property you sold. But oftentimes we have clients that are intentionally taking the opportunity, especially on a property that is highly appreciated that they've owned for years, to say, you know what, I'm going to sell this property. I'm going to defer almost all of my capital gains taxes, but I'm also going to take the opportunity to stick a few dollars in my pocket, knowing I'm going to pay taxes on that. And so that $50,000 might trigger, $18,000 worth of tax or something. And so, you end up having $32,000 left over. I encourage that, by the way, because if this is an opportunity for you to have a little bit more liquidity than you've enjoyed prior to this, and you feel like you'd like to have a little bit more cash in the bank, 100% you should take the opportunity, knowing, of course, that there are taxable consequences, and take a little bit out. And the term we use is boot. So the dollar amount that is the difference between what you sold and what you bought, that term is called boot, and that comes from Old English law. I won't get into the etymology of that expression, but when you hear that us talking about boot and the tax on boot, some boot is unintentional, but most of the time people are intentionally triggering some boot as part of their exchange. Now, the other part of your question is really important, which is, what is the consequence of owning rental real estate upon your passing? And when we talk about 1031 exchanges, what we're really talking about is the combination of doing 1031 exchanges over the course of your life, and then pairing that tax benefit with the other tax benefit of getting what's called a step up in basis on your real estate when you pass away. And under current law that's been around for decades, when you pass away, the cost basis of your rental property or multiple rental properties back from multiple 1031 exchanges is stepped up to whatever the value of that property was on the day that you died. And so in your example, where if you own rental property and then you pass away, and your heirs were to turn around and sell that real estate soon after your passing, there would be no tax consequence in that scenario, because there would be no additional appreciation in the real estate between the day that you died and a few weeks later when they sold your rental property. And so all of that capital gains tax that's been growing and growing and growing effectively is wiped away. This is not cutting edge law. This isn't some loophole. By the way, anything that requires you to die is not a loophole, okay, officially. But this is a big part of one of the few remaining strategies that allows for middle-class Americans to build some kind of wealth for their family. But I want to make clear that the step up in basis applies not only to the real estate you own today, but if you do 3 1031 exchanges in a row, it still applies. So in your question, I want to make sure that you understand is it's not an either or. You can do any combination of your first 3 questions, and then after that, take advantage of the step up in basis, and then your heirs can sell what ends up being the second or third or fourth real estate investment that you owned, and I hope it's your 5th, 6th, or 7th. But whatever ends up being the time period from now to when you pass away, assuming that the law hasn't changed, they still get to take advantage of these rules regardless of how many 1031 exchanges you've done over your life.
They say defer, defer, die is the strategy.
Right.
So,
swap till you drop is
yes, also that one I've heard. All right. So what is the typical annual ROI for these opportunities?
Well, it's a range. Right now, let me talk about yield first. Right now, the average yield, meaning the yield on equity, if you invest $1 million, say, in a DST program of equity, we talk about yield as a percentage of the equity that you invest. The typical equity is about 4% today. That is down from when I first got in this business, where we had a lot of deals that were 5 or 6%. And I suspect that as interest rates normalize and cap rate spreads adjust, that we will see over time the yields on the first year yields on these programs climb back up again. But in the first year, the average yield is around 4%. And I have to say that, you know, we've got multifamily, triple net retail, self-storage, industrial. It's hard to describe yields and ROI in some blanket statement across all these different real estate types, across all these different geographies. But one thing I can say that is a blanket statement across to all of the programs we offer is they all occupy the most boring end of the real estate spectrum, meaning that these programs are designed for folks who've already accumulated their real estate wealth. And now what they're really trying to do is preserve that wealth and generate monthly income. And so we do not illustrate to clients you know, some kind of ridiculous appreciation, because that's not the goal. People don't get rich investing in passive replacement programs. You already accumulated your wealth. We're now trying to preserve that on a passive basis and convert that equity into a reliable income stream coming from one or more DST programs. So most of the return, I think, over the next 10 years is going to come from income. Whereas the programs that we sold going back, we had a lot of programs from 5, 6, 7 years ago that are selling now where people enjoyed tremendous returns. But it would be so ridiculous to use the last 10 years as a way to describe what we think our clients are going to experience in these programs for the next 10 years, because we just enjoyed the longest real estate bull market in the history of the United States, going back to the last great recession. And, you know, real estate values peaked, you know, in the fall of last year. And, you know, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, you know, investing today in these commercial real estate programs is going to result in some significant appreciation 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years from now. That's just, it's you know, we're in a different part of the cycle right now. So I'm focusing on trying to preserve my clients' capital, generate income, and then maybe on the next cycle we can get back to, you know, focusing more on appreciation. I hope that helped.
Absolutely. Well said. Surendar asking, if you sell 10 individual single family houses and invest in 1 or 2 apartment projects, can you do a 1031 exchange or defer those capital gains?
You can. And in fact, we routinely have clients that are selling multiple properties around the same time. Usually the properties have nothing to do with each other than they happen to be owned by the same person. But you know, a client who's starting to kind of cycle out of being an owner operator will put up multiple properties for sale. And as long as they've closed within a relatively short amount of time of each other, then under the 1031 rules, you absolutely can aggregate the collective equity of those funds and put it into a 1031. And then on the back end, put together a portfolio where you collectively used all the equity from those relinquished properties, invested in a portfolio. And again, as long as the total replacement value of all the real estate on the back end is equal to or greater than the value of what you sold, then you've met the rules. So yes, there's no limit on how many properties you can aggregate into an exchange.
Yeah, that's a great way to get into multifamily. Absolutely. So Simon asking, is a 1031 applicable if I buy the new property in my adult children's name?
No. And so I'm going to address a broader general rule, and that is, in a 1031 exchange, you cannot change ownership midstream. And so this applies to partnerships, LLCs, etc. There's a whole body of law, and Alexander's heard me talk about this on other webinars. But you know, we could talk for hours about the nuances of what people have to go through, especially when a small group of people have a partnership and they own a piece of real estate and people are trying to drop out to do an exchange. So let me just cut through all that and say that the title on the real estate that you sold needs to match the title on the real estate that you're buying. And you can make some changes up to a certain point before your exchange, and you can make some some changes a little while after your exchange, but in the time period immediately before, during, and immediately after your exchange, you have to have continuity of ownership of title. And that precludes you from taking the opportunity to say, oh, I'm going to sell this property that was in my name, and then have someone else, some other entity, some other person be on title on the other side. You can do that on a longer time frame, but you can't do it as part of the exchange transaction.
Okay, great side note there. I think I knew that, but I feel like that's something more people should know.
Yes.
From Lily, in a 1031 exchange, can I indicate and give a deposit for a property that I am interested in before closing of the property to be sold? Or do I have to wait until the 45-day period after closing?
Well, let me say this. There's something called the reverse exchange. And to answer your question, I think it really depends on the nature of the deposit. But if it was significant, then you would want to do a reverse exchange. If it's a token amount and you're just securing the property with a token amount, then and you're willing to let that go as part of your exchange, then you can do that. But generally speaking, of any significant dollar amount that you want to pre-invest, then you really want to do what's called a reverse exchange. And again, I don't want to go too deep into this, but the basic strategy is you work with the qualified intermediary, the same folks that involved in a typical forward exchange, and you approach the qualified intermediary, you sign paperwork, and they will, on your behalf, take title to the property that you intend to buy, and then park it. And so they are holding that property for you. And then when you go to sell your rental property, then they already have that property tied up for you. And then you do the exchange forward, involving what technically the acronym is EAT, Exchange Accommodator Title Holder. But anyhow, and that gets a little complicated, and it's a little bit more costly than a traditional exchange because the qualified intermediary is now, holding title on your behalf, and there's a little bit more liability and paperwork. But that is the conventional method to tie up a property that you intend to use in a 1031 exchange. And I'd be happy to talk to you about that offline, but that's the general gist of how that works. And we have a video on how that process works as well.
Oh, nice. Okay. And then also, would you say that would be something an investor would use if they found a really great opportunity that they didn't want to miss out on? That would be maybe a reason to do that as well?
Almost always the reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, you bet. Is that
Okay.
you know that you're going to sell rental property, and before that happens, some opportunity drops in your lap, and you're thinking, I want to use this as my replacement property, but you haven't sold your relinquished property yet. That's what this situation is for. And that does happen. And we've even had, seen people do that with a DST, especially when the DSTs were flying off the shelf.
Okay. So I think you answered this, but we got two more similar questions from Patricia and David. Can you put the replacement property in a 1031 exchange in a trust or LLC? And then David is asking, can you change from an LLC to a trust and have the family as the trustee?
Yeah, the short answer to those is yes. And so we strongly encourage clients, if you don't already have a living trust, and by the way, sometimes we discover that the clients have a living trust and an estate plan, and then when they go to sell their rental property, they realize they never put the property they're selling in the trust. And so we can fix that after the exchange is over, right? And so transferring property that you own individually into your own living trust, the IRS ignores that type of retitling. But more specifically, what we often see is a client will have an LLC, especially in California and on the West Coast. A lot of clients will have a rental property in a limited liability company, and the only asset that's in that LLC is the single rental property. you have to do the 1031 exchange in that LLC. If you invest in a DST or other passive real estate program, you no longer need the liability protection of the LLC. And so now you're paying to maintain this LLC and do not only the annual fee, which is highest in the United States and California, but also, the tax preparation, et cetera, and administrative costs. So what we routinely do is after one tax cycle following your exchange is transfer that LLC, the DST out of the LLC and put it in, typically your living trust is usually what we see. So, and these rules apply whether you're investing in a DST or any real estate. So this isn't unique to a passive replacement program. The difference is that we provide that service for our clients. So when you invest with us, we are your first point of contact for the life of your investment for these kind of administrative tasks like retitling your property in and out of your LLC or living trust.
Okay. Also, Mitra asking, can one borrow against a paid off property and gift to an adult child for their down payment on their home? This way, we'll both have some deductions.
Well, I would need more context, I think, to answer the question to the satisfaction of who's asking the question. But what we do see routinely is people will borrow, and when it comes to rental properties, borrow against their real estate for whatever reason, whether it's to gift or or to buy another property or what have you. So there is no prohibition, generally speaking, when it comes to 1031 exchanges of having debt on your real estate. There's no requirement when you do a 1031 exchange that the loan that was on your rental property that you sold, or for that matter, the property that you bought, that loan had to have been used necessarily for the acquisition of the property. Having said that, the IRS does frown on people, right before doing a 1031 exchange, completely leveraging up the property and because you're effectively getting a tax benefit from levering up in advance of your exchange. So the timing can be an issue, but generally speaking, you can borrow against any rental property before or after a 1031 exchange for any purpose. Again, with the understanding that if you borrow against a rental property, say 2 years before you do a 1031 exchange, you do need to replace that debt. And so you're either going to have to, add money to the exchange or borrow again. And that goes back to why these passive replacement programs, are so popular. One of the number one reasons is the ability to replace that debt in that scenario without having to apply for a loan.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Mitra was also asking about the rule of being a resident of a rental property for 2 years or more to avoid or reduce taxes.
I think what you're talking about is the ability to convert personal use property to business or rental use property for purposes of a 1031 exchange. And so there are, and again, we have videos on this topic, which I encourage you to check out because we address this more specifically and cite the revenue rulings. But there is what's called a safe harbor to allow you to convert what would have been, say, a personal vacation property into a rental property based on your use of the property and how many days a year you are renting out the property and for how long. And so there is a specified course of action that allows you to start with a personal vacation property and convert it to personal use. Conversely, a lot of people have a strategy where there's a property that they would like to ultimately reside in as their home down the road. And so they'll sell a rental property, buy that rental property in a 1031 exchange, rent it out for a couple of years, and then ultimately move into that property as their personal residence. That's also a tried and true strategy. You just have to follow the rules, because if you try to cut all that too short, the IRS will disallow your exchange.
Yeah, it has to show that there wasn't an intention, I guess, for that originally.
That's right.
So the TNC landlord asking more questions. I can borrow against real property like a HELOC. Are there any scenarios where I can borrow against my interests in a DST or UPREIT?
Yes, I say that cautiously. We are aware that there are at least one savings and loan institutions that have provided a program for folks that have interest in a DST property to borrow against their interest, and so this savings loan or credit union, I can't remember which, has created a program that they've gotten comfortable with. Obviously, the paperwork is considerable, and they're securing the loan with your interest in the property, so I would imagine that the interest rate on that program is probably pretty high, because the bank in that situation, especially on a leveraged DST, is taking a secondary position on a fractional interest in an illiquid investment. And so that's a little harder to convert if you stop making your payments than it is to just foreclose on real estate. So yes, technically that is contractually possible. However, I really try to discourage people from going into any kind of securitized real estate program if you are not confident that you can go through a 5, 6, 7, 8, or up to 10-year period without needing to tap into that capital. And if that's a major concern, tapping into your equity or trying to sell those shares is the last thing that you really are going to want to do in that situation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, for all of our clients, one of the first filters we use is, making sure that they have adequate capital, outside of this exchange to deal with any financial needs that they could have for the rest of their life. And if we can't achieve that, then a passive replacement program is just not suitable. Mm.
Well, there's also different amounts of passive replacement DSTs. So you could do a little one, maybe if you want to still keep some cash. So David asking, and I don't know if I understand this completely, but what do you know about a TIC or a better vehicle? We are looking into exchange, invest property into a partnership or down to avoid tax. So I think he's just asking about TICs. What are your thoughts on that? I don't know that I understand it completely.
Well,
did you get that?
Overview. Yeah. I came up in this industry in terms of securitized 1031 exchange programs back when the TIC programs were the hot item. Mm-hmm. And this was before the DSTs became popular. In fact, the DSTs didn't really come into existence until a 2004 revenue ruling. So the TICs were the hot product, but the key limitations on the TICs or TIC versus the DSTs is you couldn't have more than 35 investors, and everybody had to be a party to the loan, and everyone had to vote. All 35 investors had to vote on management changes, disposition, etc. And so it was a really sticky. It was a really sticky scenario, especially when things went sideways in the real estate market, and you'd end up with 35 people who didn't know each other, who suddenly all had to come to agreement on all these decisions about a property that was underperforming because the real estate market crashed. And some people lost money in that situation. And And so the DST really became the favored structure because there's just one loan with one entity, the DST. The investors aren't a party to the loan. They don't have to make any decisions. The DST sponsor, has responsibility for operating and managing the property. And so there are still TIC programs out there, and one of the flexible options of the TIC over the DST is that TIC programs are allowed to do one thing that DSTs can't under the IRS rules, which is do heavy redevelopment, major revitalization, value add programs that might have a little bit more upside. And so I'm not saying that TICs aren't appropriate. It's just that they are more limited. I think the suitability is for a very narrow range of circumstances. And just know that if you invest in a TIC program, your name is on title at the county recorder's office. You are a party to the loan on the property, and you're stuck with 34 other partners that you have to agree with on all the major decision making. And that can be tough.
Gosh, I can't imagine 35 people agreeing on anything.
I've been on the conference calls, and all it takes is one person, to decide that they don't want to do whatever is being proposed, and then.
What a nightmare. Okay, well, Kay Thor, how is the primary conversion work on multifamily? Is the exclusion prorated to the unit percent?
I'm sorry, Alexander.
I don't know if I understand this one either. How is the primary conversion work on multifamily? Is the exclusion prorated to the unit percentage? Do you understand that question?
I feel like there's a missing piece to that. So
I think so too. Kay Thor, if you want to put some clarification on there, I thought maybe it was something that I didn't know that maybe you hadn't brought up yet, but a little more context on that one. And David is also asking, let's see, can a DST be used as exchanging the property to another up leg property to partnership? I don't know that I understand this one either, but did that make sense to you, Rick?
Well, I'll tell you what, on both of those, or any questions for that matter, I'm very keen on answering any of the questions that come from our webinar participants. Alexander knows this because he sees the feedback. And so if you have a specific question, feel free to send that to me, and I promise you I will answer that question on a timely basis.
Okay.
On the phone, we can do that too.
Great. Well, that covers all the questions then. And for those that needed a little more context, I'll connect you with Rick after the webinar. And so thank you so much, Rick. This was great as usual. Lots of questions answered. And I think I did learn something new. I think we're like 10 webinars in now. And every time I'm like, okay, I didn't know that piece of information. So thank you again, everyone. You're going to get the recording in the email tomorrow, along with Rick's information. If you did want a consult or a book, Rick's team will be in contact with you. So no worries there. And until next time, we'll see you probably next week. Actually, I have to go check the webinar calendar. You might get an invite from me. But thank you again, Rick, for all your time. We really appreciate it as always.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.